Hello everybody and welcome to your social studies lesson for today. So just as a friendly reminder, you need your social studies notes because you will be filling them out as I talk forever about your social studies lesson. So friendly reminder, when we are looking at this overview page right here, you need to be on the front page. As I am talking, you are welcome to pause the video as you need to fill out your notes. And then you are welcome to continue on at your own pace. Throughout these slides, there are some videos. I will post those in the Canvas assignment, so that way, if you want to watch the videos, you can watch them, and if you don't want to, you don't have to, but you get my lovely voice talking to you for your actual social studies lesson. Okay, so we are starting the Southern Colonies. As you can see from the map here, the Southern Colonies are in orange. We have the middle in this like green color, and then the Northern / New England colonies in this purple color. So it is very important to notice just how large the Southern colonies are in comparison with both the middle and Northern colonies combined. So the Southern colonies are taking up about half of the territory of the original 13 colonies. Now, the reason that that is important is because later when we go to talk about early American history, when we talk about slavery being outlawed and why it was such a point that keeps being brought up over and over and over again as our country is being established, is because, as you can see, half of the 13 colonies is made up of the South. The South is providing a huge amount of economic resources for those 13 colonies, which in turn means that they will be providing a huge amount of economic resources for our early country. So you can't make half of the land of the 13 colonies mad by outlawing something that is how they're making most of their money. So again, it's not saying it's right, it's just explaining why it's important for us to note that, because it is going to impact our history later. So when we talk about the Southern colonies, if we are grouping all of them together, talking about the climate. So if you've ever been to a beach in the South, it is hot and it is humid, and it is hot and it is humid everywhere. So right now the South is experiencing a record amount of snowfall, but most of the time in their winter season, their temperatures do not drop too terribly much more than like below 40. So they'll be putting on winter coats when it's like 40, 50 degrees outside, where we would all be walking around in short sleeve shirts. So very different there. The humidity, though, we can deal with because it is very humid for us up here as well sometimes. So you'll note here it says lots of water sources. So that means there are a lot of rivers that are flowing throughout the South. There's a lot of lakes, ponds, natural wetlands, and as you can see here, bays, which is really important because if you are doing most of your travel, especially for trade by boat, you are going to want to build your farm near a natural waterway, not only as a source of water, but also as a source of travel to move all of your extra crops. Which brings us to the economy section. So economics wise, we are talking about cash crops, which means crops that are grown for the sole purpose of making money, hence the name cash crops. Makes sense. Okay. So some of those cash crops are cotton. We know that is used to make cloth. Cotton has a very intense harvesting process. If you've never seen it before, it looks like a little cotton ball like you buy at the store, but inside that are a whole bunch of little itty bitty seeds that kind of look like really dark sesame seeds. And you have to pick all of those out by hand, which is why people bought a lot of enslaved people to do that, because it's a very labor intensive process, and a cotton plant has more than one of those little cotton balls on it. So they would be picking all of that cotton and taking all of those seeds out by hand. It is not until Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, which speeds up that process and makes seed removal a lot easier, that it's going to like revolutionize the way that that is done. Another labor-intensive crop is rice, because rice is grown in fields that are continuously flooded. That's how it likes to grow. And then every single itty-bitty grain of rice is just a small part of that grain stalk. So all of those have to be harvested by hand as well. Tobacco, which we know, thank you to John Rolfe from Jamestown, that's still growing strong there. And then indigo is also a cash crop, but it's not meant for consumption in any way. Instead, indigo is used to dye clothing. It makes everything like a blue-purple color, like a purple. So it's hard to grow indigo unless you have that hot, humid climate. So that's why it's a cash crop, because the people who are going to buy it have a lot of money anyway. Then, of course, trade is going to be important because they're farming cash crops. So you have to trade the crops in order to make the money. Just like we have in the Northern Colonies, lumber is going to be here as well, as well as fur. The fur trade is still big. Remember, people are buying fur not just for warmth, but for status as well. They are also making products that help others farm. Shipbuilding is going to come back as well. So here when it says naval stores, naval meaning ship, like Navy. So they're going to store ships to help build and repair them. So those ships that are made up north, then if they need repaired as they are coming back from the Triangle Trade Route or the Columbian Exchange, however you want to think about that, they can go to places in the south and get those fixed. All right. So your next spot here, remember we're no longer doing just fill in the blank. Here you are writing down the highlighted pieces. So the reason we are having this conversation is because there are two main types of farming in the Southern Colonies, and they are relatively different. So most of the time when you get like the stereotype of the South, you think of these big giant plantations with the big white houses and the huge wraparound porches. So we need to talk about plantation farming. So here's what you need to know. Most of the farms in the South are not plantations, but we do need to talk about them because they had such a big cultural and economic influence on the Southern Colonies. So plantations were made in order to farm those cash crops. So that makes the people who own the plantations the richest people in the Southern Colonies. And usually they're so rich, they don't have to actually work. Their job is literally just to own the land and pay the people who actually do all the work, and buy the enslaved people who do all the really, really hard work. So these plantations sometimes would be so large that they looked like their own small village. So they would have buildings, of course, where the enslaved people would sleep, but they would also make their own bricks. So that would be called a mason. So somebody would be making bricks. A cooper would be making barrels. Carpenters would be there. They would also have their own flour mills, which would be by the river, and it uses two really big stones that grind the grains for them to make your own flour. You're also going to have your own blacksmith, usually on a plantation, so someone who's working with metal. There's going to be stables for animals, and then of course those huge fields. Now, as I said, the enslaved people would usually have their own place where they would stay, usually in little shacks with like dirt floors. There's a bed, maybe there's a table if you're fancy. But other than that, people are living in a shack on a dirt floor with not a lot of actual belongings. Now, other people who would live on a plantation would be the overseers. So the overseer's job was to make sure that the slaves are working the way that they're supposed to, that they're not running away, and that things are getting done. So if you ever see a movie during that time period or look at pictures like the one down here below, the overseer is generally the person who is on the horse or who is walking through the fields and making sure that the enslaved people are doing what they are supposed to do. So the overseers would also sometimes live on the plantations as well. Now, here where it says some enslaved people were allowed to keep their own gardens near their homes, that did not usually happen. And again, I want to reiterate that that is just a very small, itty-bitty thing that they would have been able to do. Their lives were controlled in every other way, shape, or form while they were living there. So, also plantation owners, like I said, if they were rich enough, didn't actually work on the farm. They just lived there and watched everybody else work. So because of that, many of them had jobs within their community as a role in government, which means when people want to change the rules and try to get rid of slavery, well, those people who really want it and who live based off of the work of enslaved people are the ones making the government decision. So obviously, that's not going to happen. They're going to prevent that from happening. But because of all of the unpaid labor that was used to run all of these farms, the South is going to grow more quickly than the North, meaning more people. They're making more money. They're doing more farming, all because of these big plantations. So on the next slide, we will actually look at an example of what a plantation looked like. Now, the majority of farming that is going to happen is coming from small farmers. Now, if you remember all the way back when we talked about the early European settlements, indentured servants were used as a lot of labor before the slave trade really started. So the indentured servants, remember, are people who signed away like their work for 7 years or 10 years or so to someone, so that way they could pay their way to come to the 13 colonies. So after they are done with their servitude and their contracts are up, they are going to be given a small amount of money that they're then going to use to start their own farms. Now, a lot of them are not going to start off by buying an enslaved person because that was very expensive. But if they did have money, they would have done that in order to have them work alongside them in their farm in order, of course, to make more money. So even on those small farms where the owners of the farm are working alongside the enslaved people, like they might work beside them, but they're not going to treat them equally. So the enslaved person is still going to have virtually no freedom whatsoever and not be treated as a person, even though they're working right next to the owner of the farm. Socially, for people on small farms and people on plantations, church services are still going to be a way that they socialize and meet with their community. So that's very similar to the northern colonies. Again, down here is a picture of that plantation style farm. So you can see the big other buildings in the back. This is probably the overseer's house. And then you can see the enslaved people working down here. The guys in the weird clothes would probably be like the owners of the plantation, and then you probably have the overseer guy right there. All right, so this is the slide I was talking about with an example of what a plantation might have looked like. So here's the big house where the owner of the plantation would live. You can see the fields that are surrounding it that the enslaved people would be forced to work. Here we have a barn and a stable, so where the horses, animal, livestock is kept, which means you have dairy production, so they have their own milk. I'm sure they have their own eggs. You have a laundry house and probably a summer kitchen next to it because it would get so stinking hot they wouldn't want to cook inside the house, so they would have a kitchen that is separate. This is going to be the family farm, so this is not being sold for profit. It's just so, they have vegetables. Here we have their farm animals. As you can see, like I said, looks like a whole town. Here we have a flour mill along the river or a waterway and a boat here that's traveling down. Here is the blacksmith right here, the carpenter, again, more fields. This is probably the overseer's house if I had to guess, or possibly this one as well. And here we have the slave quarters. So again, as I said, very small shacks with dirt floors and not a lot of room. Okay, so this is our last stop on our beginning of the Southern Colonies. Here we have the colony of Virginia. So remember, in your first column, we need to write who founded it and when it was founded. So 1607, John Smith, that guy should sound familiar. And it's going to be founded for trade. So we know the foolish people of Jamestown started off by thinking everything was made of gold and they could literally just dig for it and it would be there magically. Obviously, that failed miserably, which is why half of them died in the first winter. So once they decided to, actually make logical choices, they eventually were successful enough to begin farming tobacco, which is their move to cash crops. Because, like I said, tobacco and other cash crops require a lot of manual labor, the slave trade is going to start happening because of that. So they used both enslaved people or indentured servants to help them farm those cash crops. Tobacco is one of those cash crops. Wheat, not really considered a cash crop, but it is a crop that where if you have extra, you can sell it. And again, many people made their money from small farms. Plantations are not going to be the main source. Then, politics-wise, this started off as a proprietary colony, which was one of our vocab words. Proprietor or proprietary meaning ownership. So it started off being owned by the Virginia Company, but eventually, when the Native Americans and the colonists start to not get along, it's going to turn into a royal colony. The government was run by a small group called a General Assembly, which just means like people who are making those decisions. Eventually, once some enslaved people were allowed to buy their freedom, or African immigrants who came over owned their own businesses eventually, but did not have rights and were not treated as citizens. So even if they had their freedom, they did not have the same rights as a white person who would also be running a business or living beside them. Social and culturally, religion, not huge in Virginia because, again, it's there to make money, but there are a lot of Christian religions like Baptists and Anglicans, which would be the Church of England and others. There's going to be little public education because, remember, at this point in time, a lot of education is based around the Bible. So if your town, culture, or government is not religious based, they're not going to force people to learn to read so they could read the Bible. But most people, if they are rich enough, are taught by a tutor at home. So once you have that filled out, like I said, there is a video I believe that I will post down below. But other than that, if your notes are finished, you are done with social studies.